Hello, this is Alex Burkett, and you are listening to the Long Game Podcast. In this conversation, I am chatting with Parthi Loganathan. Parthi is the founder and the CEO of Letterdrop, a YC-backed startup. He was previously a product manager on Google Search, and you can find him talking about startups and GTM on LinkedIn. This conversation was basically a masterclass in what I consider holistic organic growth. So we talked about fundamentals of SEO. Specifically, we indexed on what has stayed the same, what was true, what is true, and what will be true, and what's actually changing. Because there's a whole lot of noise, especially if you're on LinkedIn or in certain spheres online. There's a lot of noise around, what's new and what's evolving and what's dead. We busted some of those myths and talked about first principles of search, such as, spoiler alert, focusing on the user, right? And then we also talked about modern social selling methods on LinkedIn, how to generate demand as well as capture demand, how to bucket those two categories of marketing activities, and then very interestingly for me, how to measure all of this. I'm a big measurement guy. We talked about revenue attribution, different and emerging models with regards to that, and how to measure both brand activities as well as revenue and conversion activities. So without further ado, here is this episode of the Long Game Podcast. I'll start you off with an obvious question, something I'm sure you've been asked before, probably on a lot of calls that you do with potential prospects or potential customers. But you worked as a PM at Google. You worked on Google Search. So how has that influenced your approach to SEO or your ideology on SEO?
Yeah, so I understand where businesses are coming from. At the end of the day, a lot of companies and businesses are just thinking about this as an acquisition channel. They're just like, okay, how do I just get more people in the funnel, on my website, into my sales cycle? And they're not really thinking about it from the user's perspective or your buyer's perspective. And that's basically what I spent a couple of years doing at Google, right? Is trying to figure out, okay, like how do you actually make this experience good for the end user, for the person who's actually searching for answers? And if you start thinking about the searcher or the user, you start approaching SEO very differently. Like, sure, you have your own agenda, but the way for you to get in front of people is actually to serve that need and actually help them figure out whatever it is that they're trying to figure out via search. Because a lot of what we spend time on at Google is just trying to figure out how do we give people better results. Like I spent some time working on trying to get more personalized data, personalized results to people, for example. So we get your location data, your history, like all those permissions and asks to give you better results. I do feel like the vast majority of companies which approach SEO don't want to put any effort into it. They don't want to really think about, hey, how do I answer this question in a way that is unique or better? Because here's the reality of like another company or another website has a better answer to that question and you don't have anything to add. What are you trying to add to the world? From Google's perspective, from the user's perspective, it's just like you don't deserve, that page doesn't deserve to like exist. That page isn't necessary in the world. And so it's a waste of time for you to kind of even create that if you don't have anything to say. And I think that's kind of where the way I want to approach this, or the way I want to approach everything we do here, is trying to help companies actually figure out, hey, like, what do I want to say that nobody else is saying? Or how do I want to answer this question in a way that's generally helpful? In a way that like the big company that's ranking today, that's answering the question today, is not going to answer it. Can I talk to my customers? Can I talk to experts? Can I talk to people who have a lived experience, who can give me a different perspective on this and answer it that way? And so we think about that a lot in our tooling as well. Our tooling is not about, hey, I'm going to say CRM 7 times and call it a day. It's really about giving people the ability to like cut down time on the boilerplate work. So it's just like, hey, here's what everybody has said. Here's what everybody who's come before you has said about the world. This is your baseline. Like you should choose to cover as much of this as you can. Where you should be spending your energy is really trying to figure out, how do I say something different? How do I answer the hard questions that nobody is talking about around this topic? We'll give you ideas and we'll give you tooling to like go ask the right people to get those insights, but you need to spend your time on that stuff. And we just like help you reduce the friction around everything else. And then we'll take care of like technical gotchas and stuff like, I forgot alt text on my images and stuff like that no one needs to care about. we'll take care of that too, just to like make sure your site is healthy. But the way I want companies to think about SEO is the same way that they think about their product or their offering is like, why do I deserve to exist in this world? Like, why am I unique? Why am I different? What am I going to add to this conversation? And so that's kind of like the ethos of how we approach it. And I think that's very much driven from the fact that I used to work on search. I kind of understand like all the spam that we were trying to fight. And the last thing I want to do is give my old coworkers more grief around fighting more spam.
Yeah, there's some very obvious irony in the fact that many SEOs are obsessed with Google and Google's obsessed with the user. So like,
yeah,
I agree with everything you said, but it's so funny because to me, it sounds like first principles. You're like, what does the user want? Why do we deserve to be in a place to give it to them? Like, what is the value, the inherent value in the piece of content that we're creating, and how does it differ? And so I was going to ask about how you parlayed that into your product and how that experience has changed your thinking around that. But you did allude to it. And one thing that I found interesting about Letterdrop, that you optimization feature where you essentially guide people on how to produce a piece of content with the aim of ranking for a keyword. You delineate between, I think you call it table stakes and information gain. Is that correct?
Yeah, those are the underlying concepts. I think we've renamed them to make them more palatable to people. People are like, what's information gain? I was like, okay, it's just like, what should you cover next?
Well, it's like, can you explain a little bit of information gain? Because I believe there was a patent, or I mean, it's something that Google had actually spoken about specifically, right?
Yeah, you're trying to understand like what is information gain. So to your point, there was a patent, I think back in 2020 around how Google was trying to address this issue about, hey, the SERPs kind of all look the same. Like everyone's just trying to copy each other. And they were trying to address this problem of like when someone searches for a question, what you don't want to serve them is just like a bunch of bits of information, which are basically all saying the same thing. If one person says it, that's sufficient. What you're really looking for is complete, but also diverse answers. You're looking for different perspectives, approaching that question from different angles. In the same way that if you were doing product research, right? Like you wanted to buy something, you're not just going to take one person's opinion on it. You're looking for like, oh, like this person's approaching this review from this angle. This person's approaching this review from this angle. Like, who do I relate to the most? Like all these kinds of questions. And so information gain is essentially your ability to actually add net new information into the pages or content that you're creating so that you can stand out from what everybody else is saying. And Google wants to reward that. Google wants to say like, okay, I want a page or a source that's saying something different about this topic that also seems right to be surfaced higher than 20 other pages, which are all saying the same thing, because that doesn't serve the user. The way to serve the user is to actually give them these types of different perspectives. In fact, you can see this in how the product itself is evolving. Like Google recently did a very big deal with Reddit. Google is starting to surface things like TikToks, YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, all these kinds of opinion or UGC type content on the SERPs as well, because they're essentially trying to say like, hey, what does the world have to say about this topic? And let's try to figure out how do we find diverse opinions on this, essentially. And so that is the crux of information gain. How that applies to you as a business that wants to think about it, it goes back to what I said earlier. Just like, how do you want to address this topic in a way that other people are not talking about it, in a way that you feel like is maybe beneficial to your company, but is also like unique? And I think a lot of this ties back to why your company or your product should exist in the first place. You didn't just create like a Me Too product for the sake of it, right? Like you probably had some sort of angle in terms of like why you should exist. Lean into that. You probably know something that your competitors and your alternatives don't from like all the hard work you've done. Talk about that kind of stuff. Talk to your customers about that kind of stuff and put that into your content so that people can discover that themselves.
Do you think that there is more or less opportunity to apply information gain given the intent of the SERP or the maturity of the SERP? And what I mean is, if somebody is intending to basically get a quick definition, I mean, I guess it depends how you would apply the information gain, but I would imagine that people don't want maybe a diversity of perspectives. They want like more of a quick answer versus something with more nuance. Maybe there's more opportunity to provide something that is novel and never seen before. Is there some variance with regards to the opportunity for content creators?
Absolutely. I don't think like information gain is universally applicable. If you're thinking about glossary terms, easy to answer type questions, those are the places where it's It's pretty cut and dry. There isn't much for you to do there. Google's just probably going to pull from like the most authoritative source on that topic. Side note, I don't know if it's very valuable for like you to even try answering those types of questions if like someone's already done a great job of answering it. / those are the kinds of things which are time invariant that are going to be very well answered by AI systems. So SGE, ChatGPT, Perplexity, whatever you end up using is going to know the answer to those kinds of questions. And so there's not a lot of value in answering those kinds of things. I think where there's more value in information gain, or where you can really apply information gain, is when people are looking for perspectives, when it's not cut and dry in terms of like what the right answer is, but rather people are trying to understand, okay, like how do I learn from people who have lived experiences on a certain topic? So for example, I was recently searching around for how to compensate our AE, and there's lots of ways in which you can comp somebody in sales. Really, what I wanted to do was try to get that information from companies which understand startups and early sales hires. And so what Google should be doing is like looking for information on somebody who's talked about comp for startups, comp for scaled sales teams, examples, like interviews with sales leaders. That's the kind of stuff where you can actually have diverse opinions and you actually stand a chance at ranking on the SERP for these kinds of questions, where diversity of opinion matters. You can essentially niche down, or maybe like the search way of looking at this is like a longer tail keyword of the same thing, and try to answer it from that angle. And that, I think, is more likely to get you far than just trying to like copy everybody else and just say the same thing as others.
How much of this do you think is skating to where the puck is versus the actual state of Google search today? And we don't have to smack talk Google too hard, but there's an example of, I think it was a blog post from Zapier on how to start a business. And it was just like clearly written by somebody who's never started a business. Like it was like, come up with a business plan, get a logo, like all these things that like, if you've ever started something, you're like, no, that's obviously not true. So does Google have the ability to sort of qualify that experience and say like, all right, this is truly somebody who's done this thing or has my context in mind? It feels like there's sort of a gap between where they're going or they want to go, or hopefully we believe that they're going to go, and what currently exists today.
Yeah. So from your perspective, or from your perspective as a business, you should always do what is right for your customer. Like forget that Google exists, right? Would you still create that piece of content because somebody would find it valuable? If the answer is yes, go ahead and do it still. Like you can Google is just a distribution channel at the end of the day. There are lots of other distribution channels. There's social media, there's email, there's video, there's a whole bunch of other stuff that you could be doing as well. And so I would not over-index on Google per se, but really focus more so on your customer. Now, going back to the conversation on Google, is Google doing a good job at this? Yes and no at various points. It's a constant whack-a-mole game, right? So maybe Google was really good a couple of years ago when they got on top of the spammers and like people who were trying to gamify the SERPs. And then the game is constantly changing. Content mills came out, then AI generated content came out, and Google is essentially just playing whack-a-mole against this. And the byproduct of this game is sometimes, or oftentimes, people who don't deserve necessarily to be top ranked are top ranked. Zapier is just like a massive site, trusted site. And so Google's just like, oh, maybe they know how to start a business, even if the person writing the article really doesn't know. And what Google is really doing is just looking for signals in terms of user behavior plus the site authority to actually understand, hey, is this worthwhile or not? Right? And so Zapier has domain authority and that trust going for it, but really like maybe the other signals are maybe weaker. I would probably bounce from that page pretty darn quickly if I were really looking to start a business and it was just like, hey, like get a logo, or it gave me like some very easy information, right? And so I think there's this balance between those two, but in an ideal world, Google should be able to find somebody who actually like maybe a personal site or a YouTube video or whatever, which actually talks about, hey, here's how you start this very particular type of business, and should rank it high. But they're clearly failing at doing that by putting that Zapier blog post way up high. And so my advice to people is just do what's right for your user. And then if Google gets its shit together, Like you essentially be in a good place. If you're trying to play the short-term game of I'm going to try to gamify what Google looks like today, expect short-term returns as well. Expect to be hit by some sort of core update. Expect to lose your traffic at some point in time, essentially. And so it really comes down to like what you're trying to do. I think the best thing you can do is like focus on your users and then think about Google or the channel second.
And in Google's defense on some of this, like if you think about it from their perspective, there's a very big challenge in curating and delivering information. You've only got a finite set of signals, and like it's very hard to quantify like the quality of a piece of content. I think that's probably going to get better in the future, generative AI, et cetera. But I think they're probably looking at it from like a risk reward perspective, or like a false positive versus false negative. And the chance that a website like Zapier or I guess Forbes, like that's kind of a commonly used example of somebody who doesn't deserve to rank for a lot of their keywords. Like the chances that they're going to be like truly a spam blog post is pretty low compared to the alternative, right? So it kind of makes sense at this present day that they would use harder to fake signals like domain authority, like their backlink profile, and even the brand and click-through rate, given like that logo on the site or like the domain, at least at this point in time. So it kind of makes sense to me, at least.
Yeah. And it's all changing, right? Like we'll see what happens from the Reddit deal, right? Like direct API access to everything on Reddit. How are the SERPs going to change in the next 6 months? We'll find out, for better or worse. Guess what? A bunch of people are going to try to spam the hell out of that. Now everyone's going to try to go in like essentially whatever crap they were creating on their websites, they're going to try to create that on Reddit. And then they're just going to fight that game again. So once again, what I'm encouraging people to do is like think about the user, and then like all this stuff is you're going to be tossed around by the tide. But if you have the right assets and the distribution channels do the right thing, you should be surfaced in the long run, which is why I encourage companies to like think about demand creation and demand generation separately, and not just rely on like one channel and be sort of like beholden to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's such a cat and mouse kind of game theory playing out all the time with Google and content creators.
Yeah.
Speaking of things that change, things that stay the same, I just read Morgan Housel's book, Same as Ever. It's sort of the thesis of like the Lindy effect. Like there's constant change, but there's a bunch of things that actually stay the same throughout time. I like that. I mean, like that's an idea that resonates with me, and I try to identify those things and index on those. And then the things that are changing, I maybe try to prepare for, or, you know, hedge or like have experiments that can expose me to the upside. That's a long-winded way to ask, like, what do you believe is still true today in SEO, has been true, and still will be true? The things that'll stay the same.
So staying the same in SEO is essentially just answering search intent as best possible is probably the thing that's not going away anytime soon or ever, really. The things that are changing, I'd say, is the way in which you answer questions. I think like the medium is changing quite a bit. I think text has become harder to delineate between like whether it's good or bad. I think multimedia is going to be more important than ever. I think authenticity in terms of actually having sources from real people and being able to at least pseudo verify that is going to be more important. We use a ton of video in our embedded video in our blog posts today, actually. And all of them are just essentially just trying to say like, hey, like this is actually coming from a real person who has authority. I don't think like Google can't tell if this person actually has authority or not. But at the very least, if a user visits your site and they spend time on your site and they're watching the video, those are all positive signals in terms of like low bounce rate, etc., that are going to help you in the long run. And then things that are definitely changing or like are dead or soon to be dead, I think any sort of like keyword stuffing type stuff, or let's like figure out the LSI keywords and let's figure out how to gamify the system. Let's do 1,000 AI generated pages, which are all just kind of fluffy and the same. I think all that stuff is dead or in the very near term dead. And I think it would probably not be the smartest like long-term ROI for people to be investing in that.
Love that. And then let's return to something that you had mentioned previously. You said you bucket two things or two categories in terms of content creation and marketing. So there's demand creation and demand capture. How do you define those two buckets like tangibly? Like how do you actually like, what does that mean in terms of like how you actually expend your calories marketing wise?
Yeah. I think what I said was demand generation or creation, and then demand capture. The first bucket is essentially for everybody who is perhaps not necessarily ready to buy or in market right now. There was a survey, I think, that Pep from Winter did. And he was like, if someone's taking a demo with you, they've probably narrowed you down to 3 vendors already, essentially. And in many times, the way the first 2 vendors get picked is essentially through people just being like, hey, I know I've heard this logo before. I've heard of this brand before. I loosely associated it with solving this problem. And I'm just going to check them out first, essentially. So you just have the default, you're just the default answer. Mm-hmm. So for example, when I say like no code integrations, you think Zapier. When I think CRM, you think maybe Salesforce. If I say SMB CRM, you think HubSpot. You just have the default for everything, right? And so what these companies have done really well is they've essentially created a lot of demand for their products. They've essentially surrounded people with this messaging of the problems that they solve, why they should solve these problems, etc. And typically the channels for these are things like social, things like email newsletters, things which maybe like more closely resemble media. It's just like maybe display ads, things like that. The second thing you have is for people who are actually actively in market, and then they're actively searching for solutions. And this is just essentially being like, okay, how do I capture the people who are going to buy something in the short term? They're actually doing their research. They're looking for alternatives. They're like comparing pricing pages. They're looking through reviews. They're actually trying to make a purchase right now. And so this is the demand capture element of things. This tends to be more like organic search, paid search, and people like looking for information, review sites, being able to have like that word of mouth in communities so that people will say like, hey, like I recommend this product when somebody asks those types of questions. And so I think based on your business and where you are, you need to decide whether you want to invest in demand capture or demand generation first. Every mature company should be investing in both of these. I think if you're in a very large existing market, existing category, and then there's already a lot of demand and people are just like looking around constantly. So you have enough business within the demand capture market. And so if you just like niche down within that capture, like if like CRMs for construction workers or something along those lines, you can just capture the latent demand in there and that will take you pretty darn far. On the flip side, if you are a business where you don't have a clear category or people don't quite know what they're looking for, and you have to change people's minds about what they need. Maybe the first time Zapier came out, nobody really knew what a no-code integration was. In those cases, you have to actually create demand. You have to educate the market and tell them like, hey, like here's what is possible. Here's what you can do. And so then you would be investing in essentially helping people understand like, you actually do have a problem. And here's a solution that exists that you didn't know was a thing that you could do. And so you might want to invest more in that if you fall into that category.
And how do you guys approach that blend? Because in some sense, I can see you fitting into existing categories, as in like SEO software is very well established. And then even like the LinkedIn tool that you have, it's like employee advocacy or social media marketing, right? You could easily fit those into those buckets. But then I think that your platform as a whole is very opinionated and it more resembles something novel to me, which is like, it's like holistic organic growth, or I don't even know what you would call it, but there's sort of an educational aspect to, well, even like the information gain stuff that we were talking about, right? Like there's a new way of looking at things. So at this stage in your company growth, how are you looking at that distribution?
Yeah, so we actually focus a lot on demand generation because to your point, I think we're doing something that's a little bit new. In many ways, we cut across a lot of different tools, specifically for B2B companies, right? So instead of thinking, like, I just don't like thinking about channels in isolation. I like thinking about what are your customers need? What does your user need? How do you understand them? And then how do you figure out like what are the ideas that need to be communicated to them? and then hit them on all the right channels, like in an omnichannel approach, right? And so, yes, we do hit across SEO. Yes, we do hit across LinkedIn and social selling. And so we kind of cut across all of these more established categories, and we could maybe compete in each one of them. We will lose if somebody is looking for something very deep in any one of those. So for example, if you're looking for social media software, we would lose against Hootsuite or Sprout Social if you were just looking for the entire package. Where we would win is if you were like, I'm a B2B company which just cares about LinkedIn, and I really want to do social selling and turn my sales team and my exec team into very effective demand generation machines. Then we beat Sprout Social hands down, right? So we've essentially niched down, and we say like, cool, as a B2B company, you didn't care about the Instagram posting features on Sprout Social anyways. So like, screw that, just like focus on this. And then we'll also help you with the other things which really matter to you on SEO as well. Like, you're probably very different from a company that's trying to do like location SEO for like plumbers. Like, we're not going to help you with that a lot, but we're going to help you with these like B2B type SEO pieces, which have like opinions and things along those lines. So we spend a lot of our time on demand generation just because we kind of cut across all of these. We do get a little bit of demand capture. It tends to be like very niche things where someone's searching for something very specific that we do really well. It's like social selling for LinkedIn or something along those lines. But apart from that, we're mostly invested in demand generation right now. And that's where I'd say like most of our, like well over 70% of our inbound business comes from. And then the minority is from SEO right now. As we change as a business, as we mature, it will change, obviously, like how we think about these things. We're like, oh, we can actually go more top of funnel, kind of like the stuff that Zapier does right now. It's like, why is Zapier writing about like how to start a business, right? Because they can, basically.
So of that 70% of inbound leads that are coming via demand generation, that broader bucket, you don't have to say the specific amount, but a lot of that's coming from LinkedIn, right? Like you're doing very well at LinkedIn yourselves. You're kind of dogfooding like something that you're building for customers as well. So can you tell me about your approach to LinkedIn?
Yeah. So I want to say that actually like our business is probably half and half outbound and inbound, and all of it plays together really, right? So on the LinkedIn side of things, I'm just trying to be a helpful resource for people who I think are in our ICP. Part of that is creating content. Part of that is making sure that content is seen by potential prospects. So prospects across my network, across my sales team's network as well. We use our tooling for that. I also make it easy for me to create content because I've already said a bunch of hopefully smart things in the past. I don't need to repeat myself or think too hard every day. A lot of it is repurposed, honestly. Like probably like half my stuff or more than half my stuff is just something I've said in the past or something somebody else smart has said in the past that is just kind of like repurposed and into something that I can post. For example, I liked something that Chris Walker said in a YouTube video. I just dropped it into Letterdrop and I had a post ready to go. I added like a little spin to it and I'm like, cool, that's my couple thousand impressions for today for anybody who wanted to learn about like ABM and content. And so that's kind of how I approach LinkedIn in terms of creating that demand. But there's a lot of other stuff you have to do in conjunction with it. You actually have to build authentic relationships. You do want to go and like actually talk to people. You're just not a megaphone, but you're also trying to build those relationships. We will actually go and like DM people and try to be like, hey, like, do you want to be on my podcast? Do you want, like, I saw you like this post that I created about content attribution, revenue attribution. Is that something like you want to talk about? Here's like a guide on that, etc. So there's a combination of like inbound and outbound there, but we try to do it in a way that feels organic and authentic. The point of this demand generation content in many ways is to create lures or create intent data or create triggers essentially, right? If you want to do good outbound, you need good triggers. You need a conversation starter. You can't just like reach out to people cold. And one way in which you can get triggers is like, oh, like, let me go do research on the company, look at all their stuff, and then make an observation and reach out. The other way you can create triggers if you can't find anything that way, is to create your own triggers by putting out content. These are essentially like fishing lures you're putting out in the world. People engage with them. When they engage with them, they're giving you signal. They're giving you data in terms of saying like, hey, I'm actually interested in this topic. And now it's easy for you to actually reach out and have a conversation with them because they're hand raisers. They've told you like, I actually care about something. And so a lot of what we do with our content is essentially giving the sales team more opportunities to have conversations by creating hand raisers. So through our website content, through our LinkedIn content, we actually use our tooling to actually observe who is liking things, who is commenting on things, who is visiting our site, what is the sequence of pages, or like what are the pages that they've read, and can we label them based on what they care about and their interest, and can we automatically suggest like the next thing that we might want to send to them to start a conversation. So earlier when we were talking offline, I mentioned like I want to talk about I'm thinking a lot about revenue attribution, and so this is the kind of stuff I'm thinking about right now: is how do you use content and your output to essentially create triggers and create data for you to actually have sales conversations.
Okay, so revenue attribution, yeah, like I've just got this puzzle coming together in my head that just sounds so complex. So you've got this marketing mix of both organic inbound channels. So you've got SEO, potentially email, you've got LinkedIn and the people who are engaging on LinkedIn. And then you've got the outbound as well. I would imagine it's kind of a difficult equation to sort of like give credit to a given touch point. So what is the question? What's your ideology on revenue attribution? It seems very difficult in B2B, first touch, last touch. It's obviously simple, but it makes sense to me. Whereas like some of this stuff gets a little too, how do you weigh that last outbound email that maybe got the conversion versus like the LinkedIn content that actually gave you the trigger to have the outreach in the first place?
Yeah. So a couple of caveats here. One, 100% attribution is straight up impossible. And anybody trying to do that is lying to themselves. You simply cannot do that. I go to plenty of dinners where I was at a dinner with a bunch of CMOs last week, and everybody was shitting on Zoom Info and talking about how great Apollo was. I didn't say anything. Like, I'm sure Zoom Info is like old and like isn't that great. Apollo is also like not that great for what it's worth. But people were talking about all this stuff, all these opinions. There was no way for either of these companies to moderate this conversation in any capacity. And there were lots of opinions swayed. There were lots of demos probably booked post that dinner. And there's no digital footprint. There's no way for you to have attribution, save having a mic in that room and like wiretapping that dinner conversation. So I want to just get that out of the way. Now, does that mean you should do what 90% of marketers are doing right now, which I think is a bad move, which is saying like, we can't do 100% attribution, so I'm just going to give up and do whatever I feel like. And I think that is setting yourself up to be fired for sure. Like you can't be doing that. Just because you can't measure everything doesn't mean you should try to at least directionally measure stuff and try to figure out, okay, what can I understand in terms of like what's working, what's driving revenue, what's driving pipeline. And there's lots of tooling and lots of ways in which you can do that, all the way from like your UTM params to form fills to IP reverse lookups. And so to like collecting data in terms of like who's engaging with social comments, like commenting on stuff, liking stuff, all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of data that's out there. And you can maybe piece together like 30, 40% of the buyer journey if you actually put this data together. Now, is there a lot of stuff missing there? Like, hell yeah. Does it at least directionally let you know, like when was the first time this person started engaging with our content or like engaging in this conversation? Like, what are the things which contributed to that? What do we know about what this person cares about based on like what they've engaged with, what they've asked, like what they've read? That's all data you can use to actually A, improve your outbound and retargeting, and then B, inform how you make future content, right? So you can say, actually, one thing that we've discovered, we've started rolling out a lot of our revenue attribution features to our customers. Something like 70% of content does not get touched or like does not have any impact on revenue. And so I think there's this joke in marketing, it's working, we just don't know which part of it is working, right? And so this is actually like good data telling you that like, hey, it's only this 30% of stuff that you've created that has ever been touched by somebody who eventually became close-won revenue. Maybe what you should be doing is like defending that content for SEO. maybe what you should be doing is redistributing that stuff on LinkedIn and in your newsletter. And all this other stuff, I'm not saying that it's useless. Like I said, attribution is not 100%. Maybe people are reading it and coming in. It's just that we don't know. And so it's kind of a toss up if you want to keep defending that stuff, or you want to keep optimizing that stuff, or you want to keep redistributing that stuff. It's kind of a toss up is what I'm saying. And so I don't think there's any harm in arming people with data to make informed decisions like this and be smarter about how they do marketing. I think more marketers really need to like wisen up and start using data to inform their campaigns, or inform like, hey, like, here's how sales and marketing should be aligned, as opposed to kind of like just flying blind and saying like, oh yeah, like this is a campaign I want to do. Like we have a bunch of creative, like people are going to consume our media. Like it's the next Netflix. I just look at that stuff and I'm like, no, like it's very hard for me to take you seriously when you're ignoring data. You're leaning way too hard into the creative, and your CEO and your board are just looking at you being like, this is really expensive. And I don't know if like we have the ROI to justify it. And so I think a lot of marketers who are in this mindset are doing themselves a disservice by exclusively doing that kind of marketing.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that's how we first met. You had written that blog post on like every media company, or every business is a media company is BS. Here's why. So I'm glad you just touched on that real quick. We can put that in the show notes. Man, attribution is such a heavy issue. I used to work in analytics and experimentation, so this is a hobby horse of mine in some ways. One idea that came to mind is, before you had mentioned sort of the two buckets of marketing. On one side, there it's sort of like you were alluding to top of mind awareness, right? Like when you think about CRM, you think about this company. When you think about low code automation, you think about this company, and that doesn't necessarily translate to revenue or even opportunities or pipeline. It does, right? Like, but you're not going to often catch the single touch point maybe that led to them thinking of that in their brain. So I'm wondering, right? Like we have revenue attribution and sort of growth marketing, and like we're always aimed at like acquisition metrics or revenue metrics. And then there's this other side, and maybe that's demand generation, and often people call it brand marketing. And I think a lot of times people say, all right, let's measure the conversion focus, the revenue focus stuff, and let's not measure the brand stuff. But there's still outcomes that you want with brand, right? Like there's still like ways that you could possibly measure if brand affinity or brand recall or brand awareness or saturation. So I'm almost like just pondering, like, should we have two different attribution models depending on the bucket of marketing activities that are going on in a company, right? Like it may not be fair to measure, what's that old, like maybe it's an Einstein quote or something like that, measure a fish by, an elephant by its ability to swim or something like that. I don't even know the quote, but you know what I mean? Like it's kind of an unfair way to measure brand by the revenue side and vice versa.
Yeah. First off, I think elephants are really good at swimming actually, but that's besides the point. So I agree with you. I think there's something to be said about brand awareness, like just being like the default option for people. The thing is, you can kind of measure that too, right? In the sense that we have people who we know have commented on or liked LinkedIn posts from 8 months ago, have been reading like guides and blog posts from us from like a long time ago, and they enter a buying cycle now, right? Like there are people who we first started talking, or we saw them engaging with our stuff last summer. And so if you want to be all last touch about it, weighted attribution, all that stuff, which I think is pointless, quite frankly, sure, like you'll miss all that earlier stuff. I think what's more important is just acknowledging that stuff happened way back when, before your buyer was in market. They were actually like consuming your content. And so you can actually add that into your attribution mix. And I think the way people just go into this is just understanding that you're just really uncovering like 30-40% of the dark funnel. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that is not happening. You're using this data to inform your decisions. You're not using this data. You're not using this data to just strictly be like, hey, like this is ground truth, and we're going to ignore everything else because this is the only way in which people found us. This is just telling you this is some of the ways in which people found you, and you should at the very least pay attention to these. you should probably be paying attention to more than these. And I think what people do today is they just don't pay attention to anything. They're just like, we talk to our customers, the number of them where all they care about is just like raw traffic or just like truly vanity metrics is truly, it's insane. And I understand why from their sales team's perspective, from the CEO's perspective, from the board's perspective, they're looking at this and just being like, what do I do with this traffic? Who are these people? Why do none of them want to buy our product? Or like, why are we not having conversations with them? Is a real problem, I think, that a lot of marketers are failing to address in their conversations with their other go-to-market counterparts.
You know, it's kind of funny when you mention that is like one thing that I've noticed from working with a variety of companies is that the largest, most revenue-wise successful companies tend to be the ones who just measure the vanity metrics.
Interesting.
Like there's an old stodgy, like, $1 billion plus revenue company that we work with. And when we first came in, we're like, oh, what other marketing activities are you doing? And they're like, oh, webinars. And we're like, oh, how are they going? And they're like, what do you mean? We're like, well, how many people attend? How many register? Like, how does that translate to revenue? And they're like, I don't really know. And then you've got this other side of the market that's startups who are maybe like overthinking things sometimes. And actually they could benefit from a little bit of that like Chad-like energy on the enterprise side. They're like, I don't know, traffic good, right? But it's just a kind of a trend that I've noticed. I'm actually curious from your perspective, going back to like the earlier part of the conversation on SEO, from your like, ear to the ground, talking with customers in this space, like, are there any trends that you've noticed with regards to like what the conversation is in this space? I mean, you could delineate by like company size or maturity or industry. Like, what are you seeing trend wise with like SEO, demand generation, like any of the tools that you're offering? Like, what are you hearing from the streets?
Yeah, I'd say like a lot of the things I talked about today in terms of social selling and demand generation, and all this kind of stuff is still early. Like most people are not privy to it. Like most people are not on top of it. Most people are shy. Everybody's just like display ads and that's pretty much it. The companies which get it are doing pretty well. They have these brands. They like people come to them essentially. And I still think it's a very small minority of companies who are doing this kind of stuff. The vast majority of companies we talk to really want to do old school SEO. Mm-hmm. And we have like a great offering for them to do that themselves. I struggle with a lot of them not wanting to do things the way we advise them to do it. Going back to our earlier conversation, just like thinking about your customer, a lot of them ask us for hacks and shortcuts. A lot of people are just like, why can't, or like, oh, why can't I just like publish this thing that Letterdrop generated for me just as is? And I was like, no, this is a baseline. Please work on top of that. And people just don't want to. I'm still seeing like the vast majority of the market still thinking like 10 years ago. And they're still thinking about, okay, like how do I do SEO? They're still thinking about not necessarily terms that they even have a chance of ranking for. They're going after like much bigger dogs, but they're not necessarily like thinking about all this stuff strategically. I think a lot of our customers could probably be using our tooling to be way more effective when paired with the right strategy, which we're trying to help people think through. So that's my critique, actually, like going back to your like things aren't changing. All the stuff you hear on LinkedIn about like cutting edge stuff and like how like everything is changing. It's still a minority of the market that's actually like paying attention, doing things this way. The vast majority of the market is just doing very simple things the old school way. There's probably a lot of inefficiency in there, and time will tell in terms of like how long it takes them for them to like kind of like wisen up and maybe think about, okay, like maybe here's a different way of spending the exact same resources, time and money to get way better results.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny the difference between like what you hear in the field versus what you see on LinkedIn or in certain spheres online. We have like this very, very large client, like one of the biggest B2B brands in the world. And we were at an in-person event with them. And they're like, man, you must be so in demand, like this keyword research, this SEO stuff you're doing. It's so incredible. I'm like, man, you should tell the people on LinkedIn that, because sometimes it doesn't feel like it. But they're like, wow, this is wizardry. This is awesome. Okay, so back to the point on like the things that are changing and things that are staying the same. Investing in preparedness. I'm going to end with like a high level question. So take it as you will. But given your experience at Google, given what you're building, given a little bit of speculation on where generative AI may end up, how would you be investing skill wise in the future as a marketer?
This doesn't just apply to marketers. I think this applies to everybody right now. It's not clear like how far we are from like true Gen AI and autonomous agents. I think if you're on Twitter, you probably saw like some pretty whack demos in terms of AI software engineers. That just brings up a lot of questions. If you can automate that, like that changes the dynamics of a lot of the products we're building and changes the economics of a lot of things. And it also means that pretty much every white collar job is going to have to change very dramatically if these things come out. Heck, in some ways, what we're trying to do at Letterdrop is we're trying to reduce the reliance on like an individual marketer, right? What we're trying to do is essentially help a smart marketer orchestrate a system that does a lot of the work for them. It's listening, it's learning about like what's working, what's not working. It's giving you a menu of options and just saying like, hey, like, what do you want to do? It's giving you your first drafts for a whole bunch of stuff because it already knows like all the stuff you've created historically. It has a lot of stuff to pull from. It's just like, okay, like now you just kind of have to repurpose really. Saying like, cool, like one click, can I go like interview somebody for you and get that information for you? And then it's redistributing all this stuff. We're already connected to all of your teammates' accounts. It's putting this out into the world and learning from it again. And so if we succeed at what we're doing, there is a diminished need for somebody to sit in a bunch of tools and do all this stuff. And so then the question becomes like, what is the role of a marketer? The role of a marketer is really just strategy at that point in time and doing all the stuff that humans are really good at. So knowing how to build relationships, knowing how to like understand your customer, being able to really truly grasp like what their problems are, what they need help with, how your product fits into all of these kinds of things, and feed these sorts of inputs into systems like Letterdrop. I think that's where like marketing skill is really going to come in. It's just really like truly understanding the business, truly understanding like what are the playbooks you want to be running, what's going to work for you, and then essentially sending off an AI agent to go and pull a lot of stuff together for you on the other end. And so TLDR is learn to do the hard work and really understand your business and your customer. I think the vast majority of people I talk to just do not understand the businesses that they operate in at all. It's kind of crazy, actually. Like I talk to marketers who are just like, I don't know, like we sell some sort of like technical dev tool and I barely understand it. I'm like, probably should go understand that a bit better. So that's number one. The second thing is just be ready to adapt to change. I think my background's in software engineering and product management. I think a lot of my friends and people I know are very open to just trying like very new things and dealing with, oh yeah, here's like me like typing away in a command line and everything's always broken constantly. And that's just normal to them. I think there are a lot of marketers who are technology averse. They don't like trying new things. They don't know how to intelligently approach things, or they don't know like what is a good use case for technology and what is a bad. And so I think a good skill set to have is being able to like sniff out BS, understand like when and how you can be using technology in a smart way, and then actually leveraging it as quickly as you can and not being afraid of it or being sort of a Luddite about it. But at the same time, like not over delegating to it. I know somebody who would ask Bard, like, what's the keyword search volume for like something? I was like, that is an LLM generating a random number for you.
I've seen so much of that. I'm like, you do know how these work, right? Like, this is not
exactly. I'm like before you use technology, you need to understand how it works. Yeah, and I just look at that. And I'm like, if you're a marketer in those shoes, like the future does not look bright for you unless you learn how to adapt and get smart about this stuff.
Well, hey, that's great. I like that because the Nassim Taleb has this quote. It's like invested in preparedness, not prediction. And I feel like a lot of this is valuable and scarce today. Like you had mentioned, so many people don't understand the business context. So many people have trouble critically thinking and thinking strategically. So it's like, that's a good investment today, even if nothing changes in the future, right? So I really like that. Thank you so much. I feel like there's so much valuable stuff in this conversation. So thanks for doing this. And where do you want to point people online?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me. This was definitely like one of my more fun podcast episodes. I felt like it was a real conversation. If people want to find me online, definitely look to LinkedIn. I'm Parthi Loganathan on LinkedIn. If you can't spell that, it's just Parthi space, like search Letterdrop, you'll probably find me. And if you want to shoot me an email, I'm Parthi at letterdrop.com. And yeah, if you have any questions about any of the topics I talked about, or you just want to jam on like go to market in B2B in general, I'm happy to chat.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much.